Self-proclaimed as a zombie hunter, Bryan Patrick Miller took inspiration from Resident Evil video games and movies to commit his atrocities. He took his fascination with blood to the limit, taking advantage of the vulnerability of two women whom he mercilessly harmed with a bladed weapon. It is said that he claimed more victims during the years he evaded justice. However, he could only be linked with evidence to the murders of Angel Brosseau and Melanie Barnas. One of the most disturbing findings was that of a human feces floating in a canal in northern Phoenix, Arizona. This was detected in the vicinity of an area where fishing was allowed. A man named Mark was the one who discovered it and immediately reported it to the authorities. But in reality, there wasn't much uncertainty about the person's identity, as Angela's lifeless body had previously been recovered from the same canal. The question here is, how did she end up there in such a disturbing way? But first, let me tell you about Angela. Her full name was Angela Mary Brosseau, a girl born in Pennsylvania on November 8, 1970. She had just graduated from the Los Angeles Institute of Technology when the man who would end her days crossed her path. It was around the year 1992, and the young professional and independent woman was in a romantic relationship with Joseph Krakowitz. 24 years old, he was still a student, but at the Phoenix campus in Arizona. Both very much in love, they decided to take the next step and start a life together. For this reason, they moved to Arizona. There, he could continue his studies while she would find a job and new hobbies to have fun. Adapting to their new reality was not very difficult. Angela quickly found a place where she could continue with her sporty lifestyle. She enrolled in aerobics classes where she spent 3 days a week. Being then a lover of physical activity, it didn't seem enough to go to the gym without complementing her routine with a bike ride almost daily. She especially liked to travel a few kilometers along the edge of a canal that crossed the entire metropolitan area of Phoenix, accompanied by bridges, restaurants, and other local places, as well as very relaxing landscapes. It soon became one of her favorite activities. Obviously, she had no idea that this healthy hobby would be the one that would lead her straight to St. Peter. So it all started on the afternoon of November 8, 1992. The young couple had spent the afternoon celebrating Angela's 22nd birthday. They had a date at their favorite restaurant and talked for hours. Both were extremely happy to have achieved their goal of starting a life together, and with the girls' celebration, nothing deserved more than a delicious cake. That's why Joseph got to work, and just before 7 in the evening, he decided to bake it himself. However, there was one thing left to do before he could start cooking. Their bikes were being repaired, and they needed to pick them up as soon as possible, so they left in a hurry and returned in time to make the cake. However, very excited about her bike being ready, Angela wanted to go out for a little ride. "I'll go for a quick spin," she told her boyfriend. Soon after, they kissed goodbye and the girl resumed her usual route she'd been following for the past months. The more she pedaled, the closer she got to, unfortunately, her cruel fate, and unexpectedly, someone knocked her down. Meanwhile, at home, the young man was waiting for her to continue with the celebration. However, as the hours passed with no sign of her, Joseph began to worry. He wondered why his girlfriend wasn't showing up at the door. It was very strange that she was taking so long, especially considering the significance of the day. They were, as I remind you, about to make this cake. So when he could no longer stand the uncertainty, he ran to the police station. Unfortunately, the search ended the next day with the worst news. The woman's naked body had been found in the Arizona Canal area thanks to a cyclist passing by. You can imagine that the discovery was devastating for Joseph, both for having lost his partner and for the sinister way in which she was found. Although there was no doubt that it was Angela, thanks to forensic analysis, she was without her top and had deep cuts in her skin. Incredibly, there was a head lurking around there or hidden somewhere nearby. At the moment, there was no idea who could have done something so disturbing, so atrocious, but there was certainty that unfortunately she had suffered intimate abuse before passing away. By then, the authorities, in conjunction with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, were already developing a criminal profile that could give some indication of the suspect, but that task would not really be of much use, at least for the moment. The truth is that the person they were looking for was named Bryan Patrick Miller, 20 years old. He is originally from Trenton, which is in Michigan, and carries a quite disturbing history whose dark shades began to be drawn from his childhood. Let me share his background. His mother was, or is, Ellen Miller. In truth, she never developed the expected maternal instinct post-birth. On the contrary, given the loss of her husband before the birth of Patrick, she felt extremely overwhelmed by having to raise him alone, which she did in the worst way, by the way. She was never careful with her derogatory comments towards her son, making him feel like someone who was not wanted or protected, let alone loved. As a result, the boy's emotional and psychological state was severely affected, later manifesting in his rebellious behavior. By the time he was 16 years old, he had already committed a series of minor crimes, among which the most serious was a provoked fire. However, the worst was yet to come, as around that time in 1989, he was arrested for attacking a woman with a knife in a shopping center. However, due to his minority age, he was only confined to a juvenile institution until he turned 18 years old. It is said that 2 years after his release, he also took the life of a 13-year-old girl named Brandy Myers, as well as Shannon Ormock, who was 16 years old. The whereabouts of the first one are still unknown, and the second one curiously appeared lifeless shortly after nothing was known about Brandy. So it is likely that both cases are linked to each other, as well as to Angela and Melanie's, but it is something that unfortunately will never be known. And on the other hand, right after the homicide committed against a young woman from Pennsylvania, Patrick began what would be his longest relationship. The girl's name was Amy. Not much is publicly known about her personal life except for the statements she gave after the true face of this guy was revealed, because while he was with her, he committed another crime just as disturbing as the previous one. Now facing Melanie Bernas, this girl met the same fate as Angela. Unfortunately, she was only 17 years old and was in high school. Interestingly, she was also riding a bike when a man knocked her down. Her lifeless body was found in the Arizona Canal in September 1993. And it didn't take much for the authorities to deduce that both crimes had been committed by the same person, the same executioner. Deoxyribonucleic acid evidence was collected from the scene. However, there was no suspect for it to be compared with. Unfortunately, due to a lack of evidence, clues, or even indications pointing to a possible culprit, the years dusted over both files, allowing Bryan to continue with his life as if nothing had happened. He soon married Amy and they led an apparently normal life. They moved to the state of Washington, where the couple lived their recent nuptials in complete happiness, as the man showed no signs of hiding something very dark inside him. However, the first sign of madness would sooner or later appear, and it did so through very out-of-place comments from the subject. He said he had the fantasy of taking the lives of beautiful people and even kept a notebook where he wrote down the names of those he considered beautiful. But that confession was not the worst part, but the fact that he told Emmy that at some point in his life he had fulfilled that fantasy. He described Angela in great detail, and there the conversation ended. The wife only attributed her partner's comments to an inexplicable sense of humor and let it go without trying to delve further into the topic. Incredibly, by the year 2000, they still hadn't unmasked him, and as a result, he almost took a life, this time that of a young girl named Victoria, who was just 14 years old. She lived in Everett, Washington, and had the misfortune of crossing paths with Bryan. The events occurred while she was waiting for the bus to get to school. She was a victim of the suspect's knife, and it almost cut off her breath if it weren't for a passerby who had the courage to intervene. Unfortunately, between desperation and fear, she couldn't give a description of the attacker who had managed to slip away. Sometime later, Bryan had the audacity to attack a young woman named Melissa. However, his approach was quite different from the previous ones, as when he saw the girl walking towards her house, he offered to drive her in his car. This was because he recognized her from an apartment complex he used to visit when he went to a friend's house. The man, instead of taking her home, attacked her without reason, but by a twist of fate, and luckily Melissa was able to escape. The next step was to file a complaint, which didn't help much after Bryan claimed alleged self-defense. He did everything he could to get his way, and once again, he couldn't be linked to his previous crimes. After this, together with his wife, he decided to leave the place and return to live in Arizona, right where everything had started. Once there, his behaviors went from eccentric to sinister, especially in private, as according to Amy's stories, she says that he suddenly started asking her to let herself be pricked with pins, this to make her bleed, and then consume the blood directly from her skin. Starting with that, he gradually asked for more outrageous things to the point of inspiring fear in her, making her never dare to protest or refuse any outrageous request from this man. At the same time, he began his strange hobbies that finally dubbed him the zombie hunter. Costumes, horror conventions, and even a car customized like a patrol splashed with fake blood gave him quite a popularity among the horror-loving public. He used to take pictures with police officers and strut or boast as if he felt very proud with the sadistic halo that surrounded him. Fortunately, at some point in the relationship, the topic of divorce was put on the table, but by that time they had already had a daughter who for unknown reasons stayed under the custody of this monster. But life went on in complete normality. Well, normality in quotes for Patrick, until a new investigator and genealogist took the case of Angela and Melanie into her hands. Her name was Colin Fitzpatrick, who by the end of 2014 delved into her investigation using a rather peculiar method based on genetic genealogy research and incredibly came up with the surname of a possible suspect, this belonging to Patrick Miller. It was only a matter of time before an undercover investigator met with the suspect in a restaurant in January 2015. He had managed to do it by posing as a security worker, and as easy as taking candy from a baby, he hid one of the glasses that Patrick had used to drink. Finally, they had a deoxyribonucleic acid sample with which to compare the evidence extracted from the crime scene of the 90s. Once the samples matched, it only took a couple of days for him to be taken into custody. However, despite everything against him, he denied having anything to do with the cases, thus forcing the investigators to use other techniques to make him confess. They remembered that years ago the boy had attacked a woman, for which he later served 2 years in a juvenile center. Apparently after the attack he fainted and didn't remember anything. After the interview and given the overwhelming evidence, there was no other option but to claim emotional instability, asserting that the man suffered from something known as dissociative identity disorder as a result of the complex childhood he had to live through. However, after some psychological tests, it was determined that at the time of the events, the man was completely and absolutely sane, so he was found guilty of all charges. Guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, guilty of 2 counts of attempted intimate assault, and finally sentenced to 2 death penalties, but not before serving 24 years behind bars. Now, the well-known cases like the Canal murders have the justice they deserved after so many years. I'm like Pepe on mysteries documentaries, where you find this type of videos, and the other I'm like Something Forever by Pepe, where you're going to be able to watch sports videos and about important figures.